Welcome to Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we discuss Trump 2.0's policies and politics and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Are we overlooking valuable products, groundbreaking ideas, and exceptional talent due to an unfavorable perception of China? Could our global business strategies be misguided because we lack a sufficient understanding of Chinese businesses and their innovations? Just how competitive are Chinese products and innovations? I spoke with Zak Dychtwald, author of Young China and an expert on the Chinese market and workforce, about upcoming innovations likely to emerge from China and spread globally, including pharmaceuticals, healthcare, and new energy vehicles. We also discussed how underestimating Chinese competition poses significant risks to global businesses. Zak emphasizes that right-sizing our perception of China, overcoming personal biases, and learning about the best ideas regardless of origin is a crucial business strategy. Let's hear Zak's perspective. Welcome, Zak.
Thank you, Wenchi. Thank you for having me. And we've known each other since the before times. I feel like relationships that span pre, during, and post COVID are that much richer. So it's been a little while now.
Yeah, it's been a while for sure. I want people to know about your deep and very rich experience on China. So how did you get started?
Yeah, I was rehashing this recently because I'm now in the sort of awkward position of having been in and around China for about 15 years, which makes me sort of this salty, older, I've sort of aged into a different class of China watcher without really noticing it. But I first came to China as a 20-year-old. I was studying abroad from Colombia, and I had made the decision, I wouldn't say on a whim, but I wasn't an Asia studies major. I was not focused on China explicitly. I had taken a Chinese literature course and a Chinese economics course separately that really lit me up. But what tilted me towards coming was I was looking at where to study abroad. And in the study abroad offices, there's all these pamphlets. The pamphlet for France, and I spoke French at the time, looked a lot like a history book, right? You go history of philosophy, history of Western governance, history of Western art in really interesting ways. And specifically, the pamphlet for the University of Hong Kong looked like the cover of the book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which would become the movie Blade Runner. And I was a huge science fiction reader, still am. I actually, it's one of my favorite ways to get to know a culture and a country is reading its perceptions of the future. But that pamphlet made me want to come to Hong Kong. And then I would spend weekends coming to Shenzhen with the robotics team that I was on at HKU. And those weekends made me realize, gosh, there's something in the energy in China, as well as the distance between how the world perceives the place and what I was seeing on the ground, that became infinitely fascinating to me. And
Well,
so,
I think
yeah, go ahead.
I think that continues to be fascinating, and
Totally.
if not even more so because of the gap of perception is growing over the last few years. But I wanted to talk about how you say you didn't focus on China, but what you represent, in my view, is a generation of people who came to China not because of its history or culture like the older generation of China Hands, but simply because of this growing power, whether it's business and economics, commerce. That was around what year? Early 2010, around that time, is that right?
You're exactly right. So that was 2011. It was right in between sort of when most of the people who were coming to China were like history wonks, like it was a each subject. There's all these stories of people who were wanting to sign up for a Japanese class and then it was overbooked. And so they ended up studying Chinese and coming to China in like the 90s and early 2000s. But it was also before there was this New York Times article, East Young Man, which was like 2014, 2015, where it became obviously a good business decision for young people. I was sort of on the cusp of those two eras.
So since then, you've pretty much stayed in China? Or you return to the US or elsewhere?
I've had a lot of back and forth. So most of my early time in China was in second and third tier cities, back when they were still second and third tier cities. I spent most of my time in Chengdu all the way up until about 2017. And that's where I wrote my book from. My 20s were spent in primarily in Chengdu.
Why
Sorry, go ahead.
Chengdu? What? Why?
Yeah, gosh. In
Don't
like
tell me
two,
it's because of pandas.
it was not pandas. So I actually wanted to move to Chongqing.
Okay.
There was in 2013, and I was really determined to try to get deep into the future of China and feel that energy that people used to describe Shenzhen as having. And so I went to Chongqing, and Chongqing is crazy. I mean, Chongqing in 2013 was crazy. It's crazy now. But I ended up hitchhiking from Chongqing to Chengdu with this guy I met in a hostel. True stories. I was 23 at the time. I met a group of young Chinese kids who, for the first time ever, they were friendships that I had made, not because of our differences, but because of our similarities. So when you're a foreigner in China, a lot of the people you're meeting, it's like, oh, wow, in the US, you do that. And here in China, we do this, and that's different. And how interesting is that? Like, you meet a lot of people who want to learn English. You meet a lot of people who are actively seeking out foreigners as friends, which was not what it wasn't the vibe I was after. I mean, I was trying to understand the not that version of China. I think that's a really thin layer of China on the top. And so this group was just young travelers. They were people who were on the way to Tibet. They were people who were quitting their jobs or in between work and in between school and work. They were just normal kids. So I just had a group of friends there. And that's where Chengdu, that's when I decided I just wanted to move there full time. It ended up being sort of the cultural capital of youth in China for the next decade. And so that was kind of happenstance, but it was a series of accidents and interest in what would be the next city of China.
And you also wrote a book out of it, right? The Young
Correct.
China. Yeah.
Correct. So I wrote a book called Young China, How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World, about youth identity of the post-90s generation. It came out with St. Martin's Press in 2018. It's now in, I think, 5 or 6 different languages. And it's how we met. It's how we first met.
Yeah, I read your book. It was fascinating, especially to understand that younger generation of Chinese. For a lot of businesses who want to understand Chinese consumers at that time, what about 10 years ago, looking at the future consumers and what they're interested in, I feel like your book is a must read.
We're now in a different moment in China's relationship with the world. But when that book came out, I was 27 and didn't understand how macro trends worked particularly well. And so people were picking up my book, and my book is like narrative sociology. Like, it's not explicitly a business book, but it got into the investor community. And all of a sudden, I started to get these calls from a lot of investment groups to come speak at their China A-shares conferences. And I didn't know what a China A-share was at the time. But there was so much interest in China from a people-first perspective because of this young generation and consumers. I ended up bridging that world with a group that was interested in China as consumers, which was really the first time that was happening. And then, of course, 2020 hits and all of that interest evaporated. And so it's been, and it became just about government and really consumers taking a back seat. What's interesting right now is we're at this moment where a people-first understanding of China is resurfacing after 4 or so years of dormancy.
Why do you think there's this resurfacing of interest in the people in China?
This probably spanned till the end of 2023. A decades-long low of journalists on the ground, executive visits to the region, tourist visits to the region, and foreigners living in China. And so if you're reliant on these bridges from China to the world, there's never been more opacity when looking at China from the outside world. And there's also never been a moment where China's more important to the global economy. And so it was also a moment where China's economy was faltering. When you look at China from far away, you only really see those two versions, right? You see big government, which for most people is scary. When the economy is doing well, people get excited about it because it's sort of a nimble autocracy that can navigate crises. But when it's not doing well, and particularly during COVID, which was a really tense time, people really focus on the negative sides of it. And the economy can be really exciting or scary. But when you're only looking at it from far away, you only see those two versions. And most of the China analysis ends up being about government because that's what's the most different from a Western perspective. And people, I think, incorrectly assume it's the only really determining factor in what happens here.
And probably most news headline grabbing, right?
Totally.
And that's why a lot of people appreciate your writing. I know you've had a few articles published in the Harvard Business Review. And the latest one, let's start with the latest one, which is about the risk of underestimating competition from China. Why are you compelled to write this article?
This article could have been written a number of times over the last decade, right? There has been high quality innovation coming from China for a while now. I think what motivated me to do this now was probably three things. First, I had walked with European automakers back in late 2023 around Beijing and Shanghai on their first visit back to the region after COVID. And I was stunned by how stunned they were. Right? The sense of you don't really think about a market till you wake up in it. It's something I've heard a dozen plus times from executives. But I watched these European automakers realizing they went from leading the world in new energy vehicles to being a fast follower behind China.
And the gap was primarily because of COVID?
I would say the knowledge gap was primarily because of COVID, but it's also because of biases towards believing what sort of innovation can come from China. The word innovation itself, people really get hung up on it. In the US in particular, I would say in Europe also, there's this vision of innovation that it's like typically men in turtlenecks, right, gazing off into the future and creating some technology that can change the world. It really focuses on that initial idea, sort of 0 to 1 innovation. And it's Silicon Valley founder-focused culture. Where China really thrives, first, it's increasingly at innovation parity, so not equivalence with the ideas that are coming out of the US and Western Europe, but increasing parity. Where China really thrives is that 1 to 10 innovation, right? Scaling, iterating, refining, creating incredible business models around it so it can create higher value products. And BYD is really the tip of that spear. With that first trip with automakers, I really realized the extent to which people were being blindsided by China because of 4 or 5 years of this narrative that was really only government focused. China didn't stop being China during those 4 or 5 years. We just stopped paying attention. So that's number one.
Or there's very little access to the fuller picture of what actually was happening on the ground. Right.
Yeah, the journalist piece is, to me, the biggest own goal from the Chinese government possible. Compared with people, it's not like people are writing less about China, they're writing more. But they're now doing it with worse information, worse access, and less empathy because they're not actually here on the ground. The second piece, though, I think is really interesting, Wenchi, which is that because of these tariffs and increasing friction, between nearshoring and friendshoring, right, after COVID, and now tariffs was adding to that. Great innovations that are coming from China will arrive last in the US and Western Europe. There's this thing with global executives where if a product doesn't land in their market, they don't think it's making global impact. But that won't be the case with Chinese innovation. If you're waiting for it to arrive in your home market, it will have already spread across the rest of the world.
Can you explain that a little bit more? TikTok was a good example because when TikTok came to the US, it became so popular because short videos, relatively new, very innovative. Are you saying that we're going to see in the US less of that kind of innovation because of all these barriers?
TikTok sort of snuck in the door as it was closing. TikTok kind of raised the alarm towards everything else, right? So I give TikTok a ton of credit because truthfully, they shouldn't have been the first major internet success in the US. I give Alibaba and Tencent a lot of flack for this. They have some of the best technology and applications in the world, and they really failed to go global in a real way. TikTok was that next generation of success. What I think is really interesting is if the US bans TikTok, it's still the most popular app in the world, right? And that's really what I'm talking about. Since 2018, there's been increasing recognition from China of two things. First, the domestic market in China isn't big enough. I'm talking from the perspective of most Chinese business leaders and investors. So this was heavily accelerated during COVID, which is the belief that if we don't go global, we will not achieve growth. So a weaker economy accelerated this far faster than it would have happened if COVID never happened and if things were still sweet here on the ground. So Chinese companies are increasingly needing to go global for growth. That's number one. Number two is we can't rely on the US market. So what people are now building in China and their go global approach, going global is seen as absolutely essential, and the US is not seen as part of those plans anymore.
So where do people tend to go now? But I think the U.S. market is still, or it used to be, where people think the ultimate market to be,
It
right?
still is.
Still is, right?
It
Yeah.
totally. I mean, like, look, if you ask anyone in China where they'd like to sell their stuff, there's no question, right? Americans are rich and like to spend money. They're the best consumers in the world. There's no doubt about it. And I was in Mexico during COVID, and I was there at the moment. So this was what, late 2021, early 2022. I was talking with a number of Chinese companies on the ground there, as well as different factories who were competing with China. And I was there at the exact moment where former Chinese competitors, right? Because Chinese and Mexican factories were occupying really similar space in the supply chain, where former Chinese competitors were starting to invest in their Mexican counterparts because they realized that would be the back door through NAFTA into selling into the US. People will go to extraordinary lengths to sell to Americans, but that's increasingly inaccessible, right? I was just at the Canton Fair down in Guangzhou, which is the largest trade show in the world. And there's no doubt about the quality and price, really, the value proposition of most everything on sale there. And it's everything from humanoid robots and those sleek new EVs, but also to like Dyson competitor hair dryers, electrical wiring, every kind of air fryer you can imagine, like really the nuts and bolts of middle class life. And I told them I was American and can we get a deal in? Can we try to import stuff to America or export stuff to America? And they just said it's too hard right now. So everybody at the Canton Fair, it was like a UN meeting for exporters and everybody was there but Americans. The stuff that they're making is now going everywhere else. Is it ideal? No, they'd rather sell to Americans. But Chinese entrepreneurs are extraordinarily gritty and they're going to survive no matter what. And if the market is in Brazil, where BYD now commands a huge lead in new energy vehicles, or Southeast Asia, they're going to cobble together a market trying to fit it together in a way that's comparable to China in terms of ultimate numbers and consumer opportunity. The Middle East, Africa, I mean, through socioeconomic proximity, a lot of what China makes with per capita GDP of around $13,000 is a really good fit for the rest of the world. If you make it for someone in Chongqing, it's likely that somebody in Mexico City could use it too, or Kuala Lumpur, or Lagos, Nigeria.
Can we go back to talk about what you saw at the Kenton Fair? Were you there before or this is your first time?
I've been there 3 times over the years, but I haven't been there since COVID.
Okay, so that's what I wanted to know.
Yeah.
Compared to pre-COVID, what has changed? American presence there?
American presence there, absolutely. There's really no question. I can't overstate enough how much the world enjoys selling to Americans. And this isn't just China. China just happens to sell the most. This is really the entrepreneurial mecca if you're trying to find something that you could sell back to your country. The biggest difference from before COVID that I saw was the quality of technology and the recognition that from global importers, right? So I was talking with a lot of Brazilians, I was talking with a lot of folks from the Middle East, a lot of Indians, that they were increasingly looking for high-tech stuff. So they were increasingly associating China with high-value, high-tech, or home tech, I would say, so higher tech. Whereas before they were thinking of it in terms of low-tech or in the middle of home appliance tech stack. The new energy vehicle thing is really substantial, particularly in ag tech. You see a lot of farmers and people selling farm equipment who are at the Canton Fair looking at these new energy vehicle tractors, the tuk-tuks that haul all the dirt, all of the different technology in ag tech was really lit up when I was there in ways that were not quite as present before.
That's crazy. So ag means agriculture.
Correct.
And that used to be Americans selling all these equipments and machines or
Americans
tractors.
and Israelis, right? People didn't think of China for leading edge. I could say that. I did say the 0 to 1, which and 1 to 10. China still definitely does excel in 1 to 10, but it's now picking up ideas so fast and it iterates so well. The new energy vehicle conversation is a really good one, Wenchi, because everyone knows what a car looks like. Everyone can tell if a car is good. One car is on offer for $90,000, thinking of a Rivian specifically. And I got to meet RJ and he's a great guy. And Rivian is a really impressive company in a lot of ways. But you can get that quality car for a third of the price here in China, and the user experience, the seat modification, the screens available, not just to the driver, but to all of the passengers. The features on these cars in China are unbelievable. And the price point is such that somebody in Mexico could seriously consider it. And so BYD sold, I think, 40,000 cars in Mexico last year. They want to sell 80,000 this coming year. And you look around the world and the trend is the same. The consumer ecosystem here is so viciously competitive. What's built for the Chinese consumer is often a great fit for consumers around the rest of the world. And people in China have woken up to that. So there's increasingly this saying, I hear it from all these investors, if you could survive in China, you could thrive globally. So not if you could crush it in China, not if you could dominate in China. You know, BYD has less market share in China than they do in Brazil. But if you could survive in China, you could thrive globally.
That is so fascinating. So, what I am learning from what you just said is if any product can sell really well in China, almost like Chinese consumers are their first experiment. If they can succeed, they can sell to most of the middle income countries, middle upper income countries, perhaps not the developed economies yet, but certainly the income level is very similar to today's China.
I think I'm going to yes and this, right? So yes, China is the product proving ground for the world, and most intuitively the global south. If these cars were on sale in the US and there were no tariffs, which is a couple of things that are never going to happen, so this is a major hypothetical here. Do I think they would sell? I think they absolutely would sell. And there are experiments in this, right? So Australia is a wealthy, culturally Western nation. Like if you look at Aaron Meyer's culture map, even though Australia is a 15-hour flight from the United States, it is culturally very proximate to the United States. BYD is selling incredibly well there. You interview these Aussies about it, and it's really, I'm not going to attempt an Australian accent here, but it's like, yeah, you know, it's a car that works pretty well. It costs about half as much. I could chuck my surfboard on it. And yeah, it's BYD Dolphin. What's so bad about that? Like they're willing to try it and they love it. Like good products at good prices is not just a developing world concept. I mean, you look at what's the biggest issue in the US right now, it's inflation. And so good products at good prices are appealing everywhere. Norway is another good example. I think 94% of the cars in Norway are NEVs, and people love BYD. They love some of these new Chinese vehicles that they're getting to test. So it's not just developing nations and developing countries or sort of the global south, but it's certainly most obviously appealing there where the value proposition is just immediately obvious, and they don't have to overcome some of the brand biases that are associated with China writ large.
It's almost like when Toyota took over the world. Would you say that's similar?
Similar concept, right?
Yeah.
And I think the big difference is, you know, there are dozens of really good brands in China. BYD has just figured out how to globally operationalize. And I think this is actually a really big question for Chinese companies, right? Chinese companies almost never fail on product. It's very rarely bad product that blocks Chinese companies from going global. It's either A, government savviness and certainly navigating geopolitics. And some of that is these companies' fault. A lot of it is outside of their control. Often it's about global management, execution, and localization.
Yep.
And the irony of that, of course, is it's where a lot of global companies failed when they were entering China in the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, right? And so these Chinese companies are now learning the lessons that global firms all had to learn when they were entering the Chinese market.
Well, outside of the EVs, what are the other things that are, gonna take over the world.
I look a lot into the pharma and MedTech space. People will prefer to use a high value cancer drug that's $1,000 instead of $20,000 every single time. And the idea that it's Chinese made, the brand matters much less there if the drug works and people's doctors are willing to recommend it. And so you're starting to see, Beijing and Wuxi AppTech. These are mature companies who are increasingly creating world-leading pharmaceuticals that much of the world, I think, will be using in the next 5 or 10 years. MedTech, look at Mindray, which is already becoming a major player globally. I look at these areas where the government is incentivizing. It's sort of like a 3 birds, 1 stone situation. So first, it's a major domestic problem in China. So pharma and medtech are really good examples of this because China has the world's largest aging population, and they're not wealthy yet. And so they have a huge incentive to create really high value, effective pharmaceuticals for an aging population. The government is incentivized to solve their own problems. Second, it's an opportunity to be a world leader economically. The world is aging. And so if you could make a good product for China, it's likely that the rest of the world would want it. And third is an opportunity diplomatically for China to be a world leader. New energy is another really good example of this. Like it looks good for China to be leading in the new energy transition, particularly as the US is a laggard. It gains the country political capital. And the same is going to be true with pharmaceuticals. So these 3 things, right? Is it to solve a domestic problem? Check. Pharmaceuticals? Absolutely. MedTech? Absolutely. Second, does it solve a global economic problem? Absolutely. Is it a viable business? Can China be a leader? Certainly. Check. And third, does it have political value on the world stage to be a leader in that space? Solar is another easy example of that. Chinese firms dominate the supply chain from raw materials to finished panels. Actually, at the Canton Fair, there's some really cool solar cleaning tech that was basically like a Roomba for solar panels that are extraordinarily cost effective and are rising out of the Hefei ecosystem. There's a lot of city economies that are starting to organize around these specific technologies. Hefei really dominates on solar. Smartphones, we don't need to say more of that. China's been dominant there for a while. And then when you think about smartphones for the rest of the world, I think China will continue to dominate and only get better. Drones, DJI obviously controls 70 to 80% of the global drone market. This is where you start to get into difficult territory. Even though a tiny fraction of Chinese innovation is military, because it's where so many people's minds go, it ends up leading to, at the very least, unease towards many of these Chinese innovations. For certainly North American and Western European countries, outside of oversupply concerns, outside of dumping, outside of concerns that these Chinese innovations are gonna destroy their domestic market, these potential political implications has a lot of people, it's keeping a lot of people up at night in different parliaments around the world. I didn't even mention AI. The DeepSeek moment is really what rekindled this conversation pretty forcefully and reminded people that good ideas, good quality tech that could also be better priced, in this case free, and accessible for the rest of the world is coming, and it's already arrived at the highest level.
There's so much to unpack from what you just said. Let me just start with a few things. First, all the innovations that are coming out of China started because of China's own domestic demand. What you just laid out is kind of different than what we read from the Western media, which tends to put the last part as the first. Sort of like there's some kind of plan behind all these innovations, trying to beat the US. I'm trying to understand what is the right way of thinking about what China is doing these days. Because I keep hearing from people from China saying, just leave us alone. From their point of view, they feel like they're just doing what they're doing, and then they keep being bothered and questioned by the US or the West.
So the wrong way of thinking about China is thinking that the US is first, second, and third on China's mind, right? And government included. Um,
There might be some. I don't want to completely write it off.
it's important. It's totally important. But first, second, and third on on the Chinese government's mind is staying in power here in China, right? And to do that most effectively, you're aiming at the middle of your population. So not the top 5%, not the wealthy people, but you're trying to create. You're trying to solve your country's problems first and foremost. I remember the very first article I ever wrote was for Foreign Policy. This is back, I think, in 2015, about why Chinese netizens cheer Trump. And this idea of America first is very intuitive in China. This idea that you should be prioritizing your nation's needs. And Trump, whether or not he's doing that, is a much bigger conversation. But that concept of we are solving for China first, but all of China's global efforts are at least being perceived. I think there's some real truth to it. I don't think it's 100% this way, but are certainly being perceived as being primarily aimed at benefiting the domestic population and the stability here on the ground. So the Belt and Road Initiative, if you listen to what Beijing says, is extraordinarily explicit in saying we are doing this to create more stability and opportunities for our domestic population. And our way of doing that is going to be to try to create a good deal for you as well. Now, the way that that's been covered by Western media is about debt trap diplomacy, which has happened, but it's in such a minority of cases, and particularly at a time where the U.S. is pendulating on the aid and trade that it provides to the rest of the world, where China is still the best option for a lot of these different countries, and people are taking that economic deal because it's good for them. So this idea that the U.S. dominates Chinese domestic policy, I don't think serves us well. And so making sure to situate the attitude towards the U.S. and the competition with the U.S. And right-sizing it, I think that's the word, right-sizing it in proportion to China's other priorities and primary priorities is the biggest adjustment I would look to make with policy advisors and businesses.
I think the right way to put it is none of the narrative about China is entirely wrong, but the proportion of it, just the example we were talking about, you can't really say there's no diplomatic or strategic geopolitical consideration behind the Chinese government when they're thinking about their economic manufacturing powerhouse as a country. However, it's not like the government is whipping the Chinese businesses to come up with some kind of innovations to be the top of the world so they can dominate the US and be on top of the world.
It's sort of the Marvel Comics view of the world. But truthfully, we live in an economy of two in ways that we do not talk about in the global media. In some ways, the Marvel Comics view is warranted, but I think a much deeper conversation about why China wants to have a role in the world and how it serves its domestic population is warranted because we assume that what China wants and what leadership for China looks like is very similar to what it's looked like for the US. And I don't think that's true. I mean, pharma is an easy example, Wenchi, just fitting into your, how you were characterizing it. The government is not creating these government guidance funds. So specifically from city to city, there are these investment funds that invest in different sectors and products and companies. They're not incentivizing for great pharmaceuticals, cancer drugs, Alzheimer's research to dominate the US. They're doing that because if China grows old and the health span of its elderly population, who all survived the Cultural Revolution, so this China's boomers who are getting ready for retirement or retiring now, did not grow up in good health. If that generation gets ill in the hundreds of millions, it will cause enormous political instability domestically. So the first goal of that is to create stability domestically. Second is economic prosperity. And third, it's like, hold on a second. If the rest of these countries around the world can use that, that could absolutely be a political lever that could more deeply embed us in global economies in a way that will benefit and privilege China on the world stage.
If you look at our Silicon Valley, usually innovation itself is for innovation. It's the idea breakthrough and also trying to commercialize it that incentivizes all the innovations. And then whether the government is going to think more strategically to leverage the sector innovations and reach and presence in the world, that's a next level thinking. But it's not the reason why there are so many innovations. Of course, today, a lot of people are saying, no, you should definitely align innovation, private sector thinking more with the national security or national strategy better. It's not to say China is a good guy or a bad guy. Setting that aside, that's not really the conversation we should have from my point of view. Instead, we should really think about how does China become so competitive in such a short time? Maybe not such a short time, it's just we didn't pay attention to it. So how can the US maintain our competitiveness and come up with best companies, best innovations, how they educate their population, what kind of education they emphasize, so much emphasis on STEM, the work ethics. My biggest worry is we're missing the real point of what makes China so competitive these days.
So two quick points. First, comparing Silicon Valley to China and to China's innovation ecosystem, the innovation ecosystem here is actually much closer to government. So Silicon Valley, I would say, is way more market driven, and that's because of where the money comes from, right? Chinese capital markets have been dead for 4 years. And so there is a much more active role in the government here in picking and choosing and incentivizing sectors, the strategic emerging industries, so that there just is a much closer relationship. So I don't want to downplay that. That does play a role in which innovations get funded. Now, obviously, particularly in places like pharma, that plays a big role. When you look at like Meituan or sort of Pinduoduo or these far more consumer-oriented companies, then it's a little bit less so. So just it's a small nuance there that's worth thinking about. What makes I think you landed on something, Wenchi, that nails it. I increasingly believe that China's talent ecosystem is what sets it apart from the rest of the world. And I think some of the best evidence for that is if you start to look at the AI teams of these US companies and you realize how many of them are Chinese nationals. Even now, right? This was sort of the joke about Grok when Musk posted a team picture, something like 30% of them, and I don't remember the actual number, were not only Chinese heritage, but Chinese nationals. And I work with a lot of global companies now. We started something called YCG Bridgeworks, which is a cross-geography collaboration lab. And there's a number of companies that would have left China sooner. Like the political risk of being in China is such that they were incentivized to move their operations elsewhere. But the big reason they can't is not because of the size of the market, but the size and quality of the talent pool, particularly the quality of the talent pool. Big companies, I'm not going to name names just I don't want to put anyone in the crosshairs here, who are well incentivized to leave, can't get enough of Chinese talent. And they're trying to move them around the world, and some people are willing and some people don't. They're trying to hire them in different countries and places. But mostly they're just trying to be quiet that they have the talent here just because they can't replicate it elsewhere in ways that you could replicate low-end manufacturing. The quality of engineering talent that's coming from here, particularly at this moment in AI development, is pretty irreplaceable and highly enviable from a company perspective, fine. And then if you're in the sort of great game mindset, right, the US-China competition mindset, I think it's really hard to ignore. And DeepSeek obviously is a big testament to that. But then you look at all of the apps and user interface and sort of applications that have already emerged here in terms of AI, the diversity of AI wrappers and wrapper businesses here that have emerged. And it's already far outstripped what's available in the US, what the quality of talent here can produce, and how well it impacts the global consumer, even if it's not impacting Americans.
So what are the risks of underestimating competition from China? I want to come back to what you wrote. We have not, we meaning the West has not been able to evaluate and assess China accurately. We either underestimate or overestimate. It's like not striking the right balance. So what is your advice?
Just the main risk that I see here, just to talk risks for a second, US China competition, the most boring view of US China competition is just looking at the US and just looking at China. It's very likely that Chinese companies will win in China and US companies will win in the US. Great, let's get past that. A far more interesting conversation is about US and Chinese competition everywhere else. And my concern is that there's now structural barriers to most US and Western European companies to understand the quality of product that's coming out from China. And then China has these structural advantages. By the way, competing in China is, I can't cuss on, I'm not going to cuss here, but it's, nobody is loving having to compete to survive in China. It is the gauntlet, right? But if you can survive in China, US companies are going to have to be competing with those products that are emerging from that gauntlet, from that product proving ground that China has increasingly become. And so I worry about US companies' competitiveness globally. Where I see the real opportunity for that is if you could be learning and keeping pace with the product innovations that are happening here, and then take those learnings globally, you can outcompete most Chinese companies in quality of global management, global trust in terms of your brand trust, which typically outpaces that of Chinese companies, and then global talent, right? So if US companies can still be an appealing place for the smartest, best minds in the world, then I think there's really something there. But if US companies stop standing for that, then I think that's a real issue, because Chinese companies are ruthless, they're incredibly competitive, and they're no longer satisfied with their domestic market.
If I can summarize what you just said, we should focus on competing on the product level. We just need to produce better products. A more cynical view would be there's no way to have this fair competition because Chinese government somehow is behind a lot of it, whether they subsidize, whether they fund more. So how do you address that?
I want to be really clear here. I am not advocating for China. There is no fair competition between the US and China.
Wait, what do you mean when you say there's no fair competition? Are you saying there's no way to have fair competition, or?
So US companies have not had fair and equal access to the Chinese market since the beginning of time. China kind of wrote the playbook on tariffs, right? And on barriers to market entry. So pre-tariff, if you look at Trump's China policies back in his first term, I don't think they were that off in sort of resetting the opportunities that Chinese firms and American firms have in one another's countries. Like I don't want to pretend. I actually think Obama, who in many ways was a wonderful president, his China policy was bad. It was bad explicitly. I think that was, if you really wanted to create a sort of more equal footing for American firms in China, 2008 was the time. Trying to do it now is much harder. So I don't want to pretend that there are equal terms of competition between countries. Where I do think global firms can do extremely well is recognizing that their investment in China, the value of that should be valued in learning from what you can create here and scaling it globally. So not just treating it as a sales, marketing, and manufacturing team, right? Not just trying to sell stuff here or make stuff here, but recognizing that the quality of ideas that are coming out here and quality of innovation needs to be incorporated in your upstream planning. If you view your presence in the China market as just competing for the China market, you are missing the point. You should be empowering your regional office team to start to impact your global strategy, recognizing that one of the great values of being here is learning from what is increasingly the best, if not globally competitive. But your competitors are no longer up the street in Silicon Valley or upstate or something that is so easy to see. You have to be willing to learn from the product ecosystem here. And however you could justify that to your team without hitting the barriers of nationalism or old biases towards China, you have to get past that mindset quickly or risk falling behind.
I think what you're advocating for is a realistic and a very clear-eyed, I'm going to just use the Washington, D.C. terminology, view of China, setting aside whether you like China or not. These are the facts. So based on the facts, you come up with the business strategy that could be more effective if you truly want to be competitive.
That's where there's so much friction, Wenchi, and I know that you must see this. When it gets into this, our system is like this posturing thing. I'm not saying what is good. I'm not asking about like capital G, morally good or bad. I'm not asking for you to move to Chengdu and raise your family here. I'm not asking you to
Or love
indulge
China, be a panda hugger. That's not what you're advocating.
I really don't care about that. Even if you view China as your enemy, I would say especially if you view China as an enemy or a competitor, you have to understand what they're creating because it is increasingly globally competitive.
I have to refer back to Ezra Klein's conversation with Thomas Friedman just a few weeks ago, a similar thesis. Thomas Friedman basically said, I don't care if you love China or hate China. What he's really telling people is like, wake up to the reality, just how good Chinese products businesses are these days. And so based on that, how do we have a new strategy? Assessing China right is more important. Yeah. Otherwise, we're missing the point. We're going to have the wrong strategy.
I almost try to stop using the word China just because it like activates this Cold War hangover, us versus them thing. Like, I don't have like a replacement word or anything, but it just puts people into a different mode of thought. Yeah. One of the things that I really want to do, and I have like, unfortunately, many ideas and far less time or capabilities, but there's a blog that I really want to make or like a TikTok channel, I don't know. But it's called Copy This, which is just featuring little ideas that are emerging in China from the ecosystem here that should be used everywhere around the world. And I think that attitude of, hey, I don't need TikTok to be global. I don't care if TikTok wins. But some of the stuff they're creating is great. And if your company in Brazil can incorporate that, or Mexico, or Utah, or Kuala Lumpur, then hell yeah. Like, you should be learning from the best wherever you are. And the best is no longer just coming from one place. So get the China concept out of your head and say, we are learning and trying to understand the best innovations that are emerging wherever they are in the world. And anything less than that will make us uncompetitive on the world stage.
What we need is a more comprehensive strategy.
I think the need to make every conversation about China about styles of government distracts us from having more substantive conversations. It's sort of the Trump card, and Trump not capital T. Any conversation that you can have on China can be like, well, this government system, I like it or I don't. It could just veer us completely off course. And so I've now given speeches on 5 continents on China. And 100% of the time, regardless of what the topic is, people will ask questions about government. And they're not wrong to ask, but it dominates what we know about the place. Mm-hmm. And I think recognition of that, as well as recognition that good, bad, happy, unhappy, favorable, unfavorable, whatever your views of the place are, if you were just to make a chart of the country, of the products and ideas that are impacting the world, and you were motivated to go understand what those were, I think you'd realize that a good portion of them are increasingly here. Get the biases that limit your understanding out of your way as quickly as possible so you could be clear-eyed. Right size your concerns, right? Right sizing isn't like a sexy concept, but I think it's critical to getting past the government conversation, acknowledging its role, and then understanding the rest of the ecosystem.
I want to thank you so much. I think that actually is the ultimate risk of underestimating competition from China. We're not right-sizing the problems. For decades, America has grappled with how to assess China. strategic partner has been replaced by competitor and adversary. Given China's political and ideological differences from the U.S., I am concerned that the current view of China is hindering our ability and willingness to recognize and learn from valuable innovations originating there. Right-sizing China has become more important than ever, and this will depend on many more exchanges between the people and a better quality of information flow. This is why we produce Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we analyze the policies and political strategies of Trump 2.0 and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Thank you for watching and listening. We value your feedback. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and podcast. See you next week.